Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. Our fifth series is focused on the last 100 years of American democracy. And today we're focusing on the history of American law and its complicated, tangled relationship with American democracy. And who better to introduce us to this than perhaps America's leading legal scholar, thinker, journalist, academic, Jeffrey Rosen. He is the president of the National Constitution Center and a man who's written extensively on American law, both historically and in a contemporary sense. He's a very familiar face and figure on television and radio and on the internet. And he also has a new book out, Jeffrey. Before we get going on the show, perhaps you might tell us about the new book, which focuses more on the foundations, the cultural foundations of American law.
Yes, the new book is called The Pursuit of Happiness, and it's about the ancient philosophers that inspired the founders' idea of happiness, not as feeling good, but as being good. Not the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of virtue. And for the founders, there was a clear connection between personal self-government and political self-government. In other words, we couldn't be good citizens unless we first mastered our own perturbations and looked to ourselves. It was really a form of political psychology that they got from Cicero, from the Stoics, as well as from the Enlightenment philosophers. It defined their moral universe, and it's deeply relevant as we think about the future of democracy today.
Jeffrey, when I think about the founders, I think about builders of homes. They create the structure and then they go away and we all live in them. Is that true when it comes to the law? Did the founders, who all tended to have strong legal background, scholarship, understanding of the law, all saw the law as central in the creation of the American Republic? Are they the architects of American democracy and then they went away and we all lived in this house we call American democracy?
A house is a good metaphor. Constitution is a Latin word. It means come together or stand together, constituere. And coming together, the founders thought of creating a platform for deliberation, a place where people could peaceably resolve their differences by reason and conviction, not force or violence, as Hamilton said in Federalist I. That was the American experiment to test that proposition. And we're finding out now whether or not that experiment will survive.
How organic, Jeffrey, was or has the law been in American democracy in the period up until 1924?
American debate has been focused on the text of the Constitution. The fact that it's written, unlike Britain, has structured our politics and our philosophical disagreements from the beginning. In a sense, all of American politics and constitutional law can be traced back to that early debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about questions like national power or states' rights, strict versus loose construction, and are we a democracy or a republic? But it's so important that both Hamilton and Jefferson feared one thing in particular, and that was demagogues. And what was a demagogue for Hamilton and Jefferson? An unscrupulous leader, as Hamilton put it, who would come, flatter the people, subvert liberty, and reap the whirlwind by subverting the Constitution. Jefferson is also afraid of demagogues, and in an amazing passage, when he first gets the Constitution from Madison, he says he's most afraid of an unscrupulous politician who will lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, refuse to leave office, and enlist the states who voted for him.
Who could ever imagine that, Jefferson?
Who indeed? Jefferson did. Jefferson's solution is one term for president because he doesn't want the temptation of re-election. Hamilton's solution is a life term on good behavior so the president won't flatter the people. But both of them see a demagogue as someone who stirs up local mobs to resist national authority and subvert the Constitution and the rule of law. And the extraordinary story of American democracy is why is it that we've had these local demagogues throughout our history. Aaron Burr, Stephen Douglas, the people who resisted Reconstruction, George Wallace at the Pettus Bridge. There have always been people who have stirred up what some have called white resistance to federal authority to try to subvert the Constitution. But for the first time, we're seeing the possibility of that reemerging in the office of the president.
We'll come to that later, of course, and could also add, I guess I was just back from Baton Rouge, Huey Long of Louisiana.
Another powerful example.
It's interesting, Jeffrey, that you bring up both Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, the quintessential Federalist, one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers. Jefferson, who certainly wasn't a Federalist, maybe was, maybe wasn't an anti-Federalist. It sounds to me from what you're saying is they both feared demagogues, but their strategy was different. For the Federalists, it was manifested in the division of government, the separation of powers, whereas for the anti-Federalists, perhaps it was rooted in what, local government, state government, is that fair?
Yes, that's the central distinction, and it's divided liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans throughout American history. Hamilton and the Federalists believe in the Union. They believe in national power, and they believe that the will of we the people is embodied in the text of the Constitution. As John Marshall, the great Federalist, so memorably said, a constitution by, of, and for the people, in words invoked later by Lincoln. Jefferson is an agrarian who dreams of white farmers ruling in local shires and villages. He's a romantic. He traces American liberty back to ancient Wales and to the Saxon king Alfred the Great, and essentially believes that the states are sovereign and can resist national authority. It's this disagreement, this division, that of course leads to the secession crisis, with the South taking the more extreme forms of Jefferson's assertion of state power in the Virginia resolutions and insisting that they have the right to secede. Lincoln, invoking John Marshall and ultimately Hamilton, says that secession is unconstitutional, and the war came, as Lincoln said. That basic question about whether local mobs, whether local governments or states can resist federal authority is one we see in the news every day. Just recently, Governor Abbott of Texas asserted the right of Texas to resist federal authority when it comes to immigration. We've only had one civil war so far fought over the question, but that's been the fundamental fissure in American politics.
One of the most moving, you touched, of course, on race and slavery, Jeffrey. One of the most moving stories I heard was from a historian who wrote a book about this, about the way in which African-American slaves at the beginning of the 19th century and turn of the 18th century, when, of course, the institution of slavery was central in the American Republic and in the American economy, they idealized the notion of American law, even if the institution of slavery was enabled or legitimized through that law. Is there something ideological, idealistic about the law in an American context or more in a universal sense?
Yes, it is central to understand how powerfully enslaved people and free African Americans invoked both the law and the Declaration of Independence in their fight for freedom. It was David Walker, the inspiring abolitionist, who first invoked the Declaration and called the Founding Fathers hypocrites for not living up to their ideals. And it was heroic activists before and after the Civil War who insisted that they were entitled to the privileges or immunities of citizenship. They're incredibly moving stories, as evidenced by historians, of African Americans who insisted on their contract rights even when they were enslaved, and in some cases, white people paying them to ferry troops across the river. That was the degree to which Americans, even while tolerating the injustice of chattel slavery, insisted on observing the rule of law. And it was ultimately a legal argument that led abolitionists to enshrine the 14th Amendment into the United States and to insist that all persons, black and white, are entitled to basic privileges or immunities. So despite the stain, the original sin of slavery, law was always the redemptor, the hope, the promise, And the story of America is the story of slowly and imperfectly beginning to live up to that promise.
Is the law then the soul of America, the brain, the gut? I mean, we talked about the metaphor of the building, the home, but is it the soul, the conscience?
The Declaration is the soul or the conscience, and the Constitution and the law are the reason and the frame. Lincoln had the apple of gold and frame of silver, and it is the conscience of the law that has restrained both the turbulent, wicked passions which lead to sin, like injustice and discrimination and slavery, and call us to our better angels.
We need to fast forward. We could spend hours on this, but we need to focus on the last 100 years of American democracy. You noted that there were white politicians who tried to take advantage of the law and perhaps manifest the danger of demagoguery, whether it's Huey Long or George Wallace. But Republicans might point to FDR in the 1930s. To what extent, in your mind, could FDR himself, under the New Deal, have been a demagogue in his attempt to, what some people at least argue, subvert the Supreme Court?
It's an important question. It was the election of 1912 that first led to our seeing candidates insisting on the president being a tribune of the people. And both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson said that the president was accountable to the people in a populist way that would have made Madison shudder. FDR was the apotheosis of the populist president in getting his authority directly from his ability to communicate with the people. And it's a legitimate question about whether or not his court packing plan, which did indeed threaten to subvert judicial independence by packing the court, was the act of a demagogue. Now, of course, there was a powerful precedent for it. It was Thomas Jefferson himself. And when the Republicans came in, they repealed the Judiciary Act that the Federalists had used to pack the court with their own judges, basically destroyed life tenure, and also threatened justices with impeachment. Justice Samuel Chase was narrowly acquitted. John Marshall nearly impeached for acquitting Aaron Burr. But it was only the opposition of Democrats in Congress during the 1930s that stopped FDR's plan. And in retrospect, it was not consistent with America's best values.
It was one of FDR's most notable political defeats, one of his few defeats. He was a master politician. Do you think he learned anything from that experience?
Oh, keep your powder dry and don't act unless you have the votes. I mean, he was so exquisitely sensitive to timing, always. And he learned the lesson when it came to World War II and never got too far of public opinion, although he was eager to intervene, and basically waited for Pearl Harbor when he knew that the public would support him.
After the war, of course, American democracy became increasingly framed domestically, but particularly in terms of the Cold War, by freedom and American democracy in contrast to Soviet autocracy or totalitarianism. Did the law change in the Cold War period, and did the law become more or less prominent in the way in which its supporters imagined what American democracy was?
Certainly the Constitution changed. After the New Deal Constitution took a much broader view of federal power than both the founding and Reconstruction Constitution, and upheld aspects of the regulatory state that the Reconstruction Court had struck down. The court also became increasingly sympathetic to civil liberties, and in the McCarthy era, the court began to enforce the First Amendment in a heroic way that would blossom during the Vietnam era, and the rights of dissenters would be meaningfully protected for the first time in American constitutional history. That was the New Deal balance. FDR achieved his goals without packing the court by making a series of judicial appointments, and his justices were deferential to congressional power, but also protective of civil liberties, and that transformed the American legal landscape.
How ready was the American law itself for the New Deal and the central place of the state, not just in political life, but particularly in economic life. Did the founders ever imagine a state in which the government would play an increasingly central role in the economy? I mean, of course, Jefferson feared that perhaps more than anyone.
It really does go back to the Hamilton-Jefferson debate over the bank. And Hamilton, the mercantilist and acolyte of David Hume, insists that the state has a role to play in supporting international commerce, and with moderate tariffs can increase the well-being of all. And Jefferson taking a completely night watchman approach, insisting that the bank is unwise and unconstitutional. And what's so incredible is that that debate persisted both in dividing the parties, which more or less divided along whether or not the bank and national economic regulation was a good idea, and also in dividing our Supreme Court justices. And after each expansion of national authority, this was followed by a strict constructionist backlash. And just as Chief Justice Taney followed the expansion of the Marshall Court by striking down the Missouri Compromise and leading to the New Deal, so during the New Deal period, conservatives both insisted that the FDR regulatory state was a bad idea, and also that it was unconstitutional, and it was that claim that sparked President Reagan to appoint Jeffersonian justices who, decades later, would begin to strike down the New Deal regulatory state.
Did those Jeffersonian, you call them Jeffersonian justices, were they schooled in Hayek and in the debates between Hayek and Friedman and the Keynesians?
It's such an important and fascinating question. What were the ideas that sparked the Jeffersonian backlash, which marched under the battle of originalism and textualism? That movement was heralded by President Reagan, who as early as 1966 invoked Jefferson to criticize the Great Society, as well as the New Deal. And it was Edmund Meese during the 1980s, during President Reagan's first term, who invoked Jefferson's claim that we should travel back to the minds of the founders and strictly construe the Constitution in pledging to appoint strict constructionist justices. Now, it turns out that the vision of originalism that President Reagan reenacted was not Jefferson's, and Jefferson thought that the federal court should not be the last word on constitutional questions, and that each of the three branches and the state should all be able to prevent a law from going into effect. There's also a lot of moving among questions of textualism, originalism, and the original public meaning of a phrase in order to essentially reach the conservative result of striking down the regulatory state. But over time, finally Donald Trump was able to appoint justices who completed the strict constructionist Jeffersonian majority, some of them acolytes of Hayek, other more traditional Catholic conservatives who took a more statist version of the ability to promote the public good, but all of whom were willing to converge around this anti-regulatory project, and we're now seeing it blossom into effect.
Is this all ideology, Jeffrey? Could we, in the future, I don't know, AI, smart machines, genetic engineering, are they going to be smart kids from Harvard or Yale or Stanford who are going to be able to read the Constitution and say, well, in this reading, Jefferson really meant that we can't have AI, that it should be illegal? Does it lend itself to smart, creative people?
Smartness and creativity are always good in the law, but you don't have to be smart and creative to see this basic debate. Hamilton, the liberal constructionist, Jeffersonian, the strict constructionist, that was the debate since the beginning. That's the debate now, and the strict constructionists, whatever they call themselves, tend to restrict federal power and exalt states' rights, and the liberal constructionists do the opposite, and that's what we're seeing today.
It seems as if two of the most central issues in which the court has addressed, or the legal culture of the state has addressed, are civil rights and abortion, particularly from the 60s onwards. Perhaps we might begin with civil rights. How central was the law in the civil rights revolution of the 1960s, particularly given that many of the civil rights leaders were churchmen rather than lawyers?
They were. That's so significant. And back to the abolitionist movement, so many of the great abolitionists, both free and enslaved, were from the church. It was a messianic movement for freedom and justice, and yet always conducted in the name of the law. First, the urge to ratify the post-Civil War amendments, and then it's impossible to overstate the shocking injustice of the subversion of Reconstruction. It was just a failure of a commitment to enforce their promise with national power that led to Southern redemption, that led the Supreme Court to strike down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, so that we had to wait almost another 100 years for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65, and to fail to deliver the promise of equal protection. But ultimately, it was politics that led to the passage of the great civil rights landmark statutes of the 60s, the courage of the people who marched and who fought and from state to state built a political consensus that ultimately culminated in those acts with the great promise of King on them all.
But was it the Warren Court that laid the foundations? I was just back from Mississippi. I went to the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson. One of the astonishing things is that in Mississippi, more than 50% of the people living there were black, and none of them could vote, or maybe 1% of them could vote. So it was just as undemocratic as the deepest part of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. At what point did the American legal establishment wake up to this? Or were they always awake and understood that the politics of this were so quote unquote complicated that they didn't want to address it?
It really wasn't until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 that the legal establishment converged around the wrongness of segregation. Brown, as amazing as it is to say today, was legally controversial and originally came out the other way before Chief Justice Fred Vinson fortuitously died in the middle of the discussions, prompting Justice Felix Frankfurter to exclaim, "This is the first evidence I've ever had that there is a God." Brown once was unanimous because of Warren's leadership, and it was his political leadership that made it unanimous, came to be seen as unquestionably right. And once Brown was right, so miscegenation statutes were wrong, and laws that denied voting rights were wrong, and the consensus followed. But it took a commitment to federal enforcement to make the promise a reality. The Supreme Court had to uphold the Civil Rights Act of '64, and then President Johnson had to commit the resources of the federal government. It's very significant that despite the promise of Brown, there was not meaningful desegregation of schools in the South until the late 1960s, when the Education Department threatened to withhold federal funding from schools that didn't integrate. So the court couldn't do it on its own. It was an active cooperation between the court, Congress, and the executive branch, and that built up the consensus.
These things are always complicated, Jeffrey. What came first, though, the politics or the law? We know we've had a show about Hubert Humphrey's embrace of civil rights, which changed the Democratic Party and took on the southern wing of the party. Did that come before the law, or do you think the changes in the law empowered, enabled, gave men like Hubert Humphrey the confidence to address this issue publicly for the first time?
It is a complicated relation, but the consensus helped, but then it could be further crystallized once the court had spoken. It's important that Brown was popular with at least a narrow majority of the country. It was supported by President Truman and, more reluctantly, Eisenhower. It related to the transformation and attitudes towards segregation from World War II, where black soldiers had served honorably, and also Major League Baseball integrating made a big difference. And it was mostly Southern resistance, minorities in Congress, that had blocked desegregation. So the court was not hugely counter-majoritarian in 1954. Still, it took the heroic decision, ultimately, of Lyndon Johnson, who was more influential than anyone else in committing the Democratic Party to the fight for civil rights, even though he understood the political consequences might be to destroy the Democrats' political viability in the South. He did it anyway, and everything that followed in American politics followed that decision.
Yeah, we've had shows on that transformation. I think it's 30 or 40% of African Americans voted Republican in the 50s. By the 60s, it was a very small percentage. How did that change everything in terms of this shift, almost a reversal in the Democratic and Republican parties? Did that change the debates over the law, or is that just the wallpaper?
It fundamentally changed them. Just to begin with, the most obvious switch, suddenly Jefferson, the patron saint of the Democratic Party, becomes the hero of Republicans, of the anti-federalist, strict constructionist Republicans who are now opposed to federal power. And there's a realignment that changes our apportionment system. It leads to the debates over majority-minority districts in the 1980s. It very much polarizes the country geographically, and it makes the Democratic Party a much more urban and coastal party than it was before.
The second issue that I noted was abortion. When did that become so central in American conception of the role of law in society and, of course, implicitly, at least, in democracy?
Abortion is an issue that was not on the national radar screen before the court spoke. It wasn't in the political platform of either party in 1973. And in fact, the movement to strike down restrictions on abortion and contraception were led by liberal Republicans, such as Katharine Hepburn's mother in Connecticut, who led the crusade against contraception restrictions. When the court decided Roe, the justices expected it would be politically uncontroversial. It was a 7-2 decision because there wasn't a mobilized opposition to abortion rights. It was Roe itself, according to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's thoughtful and measured constitutional history, that mobilized extremists on both sides, created interest groups devoted to overturning Roe, which blossomed in the 80s and began to overtake all Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and made it impossible to recognize the moderate middle on abortion, which since the 70s has favored early term choice and also favored restrictions on later term choice. Justice Ginsburg said that if the court had been more measured in the Roe decision and had merely struck down the extreme Texas law that banned abortion in almost all circumstances, without presuming to settle the abortion debate throughout pregnancy, there might have been less of a backlash and more of a chance for American politics to support the court rather than fighting it.
Analysts, Jeffrey, always love to focus on events that reflect the weaknesses and corruption or irrelevance of institutions. But what about when it comes to the glorious moments of 20th century legal and Supreme Court history? Would Watergate be an example of that?
Yes, absolutely. We'll take our glorious moments where we can, and the fact that the Nixon tapes case was unanimous or nearly so in ordering President Nixon to turn over the tapes, the fact that the system held, as President Ford so memorably said, so simply, our Constitution works, and those powerful and simple words stated as self-evident truth. And the post-Watergate reforms involving ethics and including independent counsel laws and congressional oversight are all examples of the system working.
Nostalgists always imagine a time where we didn't have politics, particularly these days when everyone thinks that everything is politicized. You point to the example of a Supreme Court that took on Nixon independent of politics. But was there ever a time when the Supreme Court wasn't politicized?
No, there wasn't. We can't understate how politicized it was at the time of the founding. Jefferson and Marshall detested each other, and Jefferson actively was lobbying for Marshall's impeachment. And Marshall was so afraid that Jefferson wouldn't obey him that he upheld the subversion of life tenure and the repeal of the Judiciary Act, because he, as he put it, was not fond of beating his head against a wall in sport. And he considered the court a Federalist redoubt, as indeed it was, and until Jeffersonian Justices got a majority and struck down the Missouri Compromise. So in a sense, there was a long period of relative quiescence in the post-New Deal period where both Republican and Democratic justices converged around a broad vision of federal power. And the Warren Court decisions, many of them were broadly unanimous or decided by lopsided majorities. So maybe our generation or the past few generations were lulled into quiescence by the false détente of the Warren and post-New Deal eras, and we're now returning to the more normal situation which prevailed ever since the founding.
And was that, in a sense, perhaps simply a reflection of the political culture of the Eisenhower years, which legitimized or a centrism where Eisenhower could have been the leader of either party and governed the country for 8 years, a period of great prosperity for most people except for African Americans?
Yes, of course, it's a really important question why American politics were so much less polarized in the 50s than they are now. One reason was before the Civil Rights Act guaranteed racial justices, the parties were less geographically segregated, although they were segregated on the basis of race and law. The question of how we became more polarized is really important. On the national level, one of the most important reforms were presidential primaries, and it was the decision to take the role of the parties out and not have them vet candidates that led to increasingly extreme candidates who would court their base, and ultimately to Donald Trump. And several scholars have suggested that the best way of screening out demagogues is to restore party selection of candidates. That's just one way in which, as national politics became more polarized, so did the courts. And the courts became openly embraced as engines of political combat, with each party pledging to appoint justices who would achieve their ends much more specifically than they had for at least since the days of Jefferson. And that partly explains the polarization of the court.
We know that recently the Republicans have taken advantage, perhaps that's a euphemism, of their political power to manipulate the court. But they would argue, I think, that the Democrats started it with Bork. Are both parties really guilty of this equally?
Yes, the who started it game is not that productive because both parties went to war over Bork. And the more salient fact is the Republicans have been much more effective than the Democrats in winning the war. They had a very clear vision, a constitutional vision, articulated by President Reagan as early as 1966 and embodied in his inaugural address and enacted with appointments like Bork. Whereas the Democrats took the courts less seriously, didn't appoint justices on the basis of ideology or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, and as a result have lost the war.
It's rather odd, isn't it, given that, if anything, the legal culture is more dominant in the Democratic Party than it is in the Republican Party. Why did that happen?
Part may have been quiescence, overconfidence. Democrats who came of age in the glory of the Warren era assumed that majority would last forever, and that all they had to do was defend precedents, not realizing that the precedents could change and the philosophy could change. The other fact is that Republicans wanted more out of the court. They wanted a counter-revolution. They wanted to strike down the post-New Deal regulatory state, where Democrats just wanted to preserve the status quo. And it's revolutionaries who tend to be much more effective in achieving their goals.
When it comes to the politicization, Jeffrey, of the court, is that a problem for democracy? You've mentioned Hamilton and Jefferson, of course, the third founder, perhaps as influential, maybe in some ways even more influential, is Madison, who argued that if men were angels, we would have no need for politics. He wouldn't be surprised with the politicization of law because he saw politics or faction as being woven into the nature of who we are as humans. What's wrong in terms of democracy with the politicization of the law and indeed of even the Supreme Court?
Madison is such an important inspiration to remember. When in the debates between Hamilton and national power and Jefferson and states' rights, Madison is always there in the middle, thoughtfully articulating a deliberative and compromised position. Because Madison's ultimate value is the constitutional value of the importance of deliberation, of listening respectfully to those you disagree with and trying to achieve, if not common ground, at least a civil resolution of your differences. Certainly Madison wouldn't shy away from political combat at the highest level. He was Jefferson's main lieutenant, but he did insist on that framework for deliberation. He anticipated Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' powerful aphorism that the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view. And although there's nothing wrong with sharp partisan clashes, when Americans lose faith in the courts as a fair forum to resolve their differences amicably, then we're in trouble.
But is it wrong to think of the law as an antidote to politics and passion when it comes to democracy?
There's a complicated relationship between law and politics when it comes to the Constitution. Law is not free of politics. Broadly, the philosophical debates on law directly track the philosophical debates in politics between national power and states' rights, for example. And yet, law can't be partisan. Judges can't be voting for one side or another because they're trying to help this president or hurt that one. I asked Justice Stephen Breyer about the relationship between law and politics. We were teaching a Zoom class to middle school kids, and I said, Justice Breyer, kids are always asking, is it all politics at the court? And he said, well, it's complicated. It's not politics. I've never seen any justice vote for someone because they're trying to achieve a political result. But it does have to do with political philosophy. And if you're a justice who likes free market economics or socialism, then that will affect your votes. That was the subtlest answer I've heard, and I think that's
and when people use the word complicated, you know really that they're acknowledging you're right. They're just... It's a nice, clever legal evasion.
Well, much turns on whether or not you will buy that distinction. There are justices, for example, who probably believe that Justice Breyer is too generous in suggesting that there's a meaningful difference between partisan and political philosophy. He doesn't think so. And whichever side you come down here, Chief Justice John Roberts insists that it's important for citizens to embrace the more idealistic view, because when citizens lose faith in the court as something that can rise above politics, then the rule of law itself is threatened.
We've been very patient, Jeffrey. We're getting, of course, to the man of the moment, or the anti-hero of the moment, Donald Trump. My rather, shall we say, vulgar understanding of Trump in terms of the law is that he has a kind of a Leninist critique of the legal state in America, and he sees everything in terms of class and moneyed interest. Is there any truth in that? He clearly hasn't read the Constitution.
Well, he tweeted that it should be burnt or broken up with, or that it...
As Lenin probably would have said himself.
Now, my scholarship in Lenin is not deep, so I don't know whether it tracks Trump, and I'm confident Trump hasn't read Lenin either. But he's an authoritarian demagogue of the basest sort, exactly what the founders feared, more interested in power than in the Constitution, and willing to subvert democracy and install himself as an authoritarian. And the founders are constantly warning about exactly this. This was the fate of Rome and Greece, and this was Caesar. And this was the story of each republic in history that would begin with elected representatives and would end in demagogues and tyranny and blood, flattering the people with cheap baubles and entertainments to lull them into surrendering their liberty and sustaining unchecked power. So it's not an unfamiliar pattern. We've been blessed to avoid it more or less until now, and we're now reaping the whirlwind.
What is it about Trump and the law? On the one hand, he sees all lawyers clearly as self-interested. The Supreme Court he sees in socioeconomic or cultural terms. On the other hand, he has spent his life masterfully in a self-interested march through the courts. So he clearly understands the law on one level, and on the other hand, he disdains it. Is there something, you go back to antiquity, but is there something uniquely American about Trump's relationship with the law?
There's nothing uniquely American about the fact that Trump said that I'm going to get a hearing before my judges. The idea that the judges you appoint to the courts are your judges is not an American idea. It's a Soviet idea. It's an authoritarian idea. I'm going to have to read up on my Lenin now for American history, but it's the antithesis of the separation of powers and a liberal democracy. It is a subversion of the liberal Enlightenment idea. And the entire American system is designed to ensure that the president can't call the judges up on the phone or whatever you're using and tell them how to rule, because that kind of telephone justice is the hallmark of an authoritarian state. So there's nothing sophisticated about it, but it's deeply illiberal.
It may not be sophisticated, Jeffrey, but it's politically effective. It seems as if the more Trump launches his Leninist critique of the legal state and these elite lawyers, people who went to Harvard and Stanford and Yale like yourself, the more popular he becomes. Has he reached the soul, shall we say, or certainly the brains of the American people? Is there something that is familiar with American history, or has he dug something up that no one had actually reached before?
The idea of attacking elites and promising that you alone can save the people is the old story of demagogues. That's the definition of a demagogue. It's true that previous demagogues haven't had the media technology that is available to Trump, and Aaron Burr was more refined in his appeals to local mobs in New Orleans to arguably subvert the Union. Perhaps we're seeing now the fact that the founders' fears of democracy and of faction are being fanned by new media technologies. And there's no doubt that the age of Facebook and X, or whatever it's called, are the antithesis of the cool deliberation that Madison hoped would spread through new media technologies like the broadside paper and slowly enlighten public reason. By contrast, the enraged to engage business model of social media is indeed Madison's nightmare. And to the degree that the antithesis of public virtue is immediate gratification and anger and resisting sober second thoughts, the new media environment allows Trump to fan our worst instincts.
You mentioned Aaron Burr, a violent man whose, of course, life and violence was very much associated with Hamilton as well. Is the antithesis of the law violence, and is that why Trump understands it so well? He's a rhetorically violent man. He was brought up in a violent way by a violent father. He went to military school. How would you connect violence and demagoguery?
That's such a good and sobering insight. Yes, violence is the antithesis of the rule of law. Remember the Hamilton quotation again. The test of the American experiment is, can we govern ourselves by reason and conviction, not force or violence? And the defining moments of the early republic were those of threatened violence against federal authority. The first was the Whiskey Rebellion, where Hamilton, as intendant Inspector General of the Army under Washington, puts on his uniform and rides out to Western Pennsylvania to put down an insurrection of Western farmers against federal authority. Next up is Fry's Rebellion, where a new federal property tax to finance the quasi-war with France provokes another reunion of insurrectionists in Pennsylvania, and Hamilton once again wants to lead a force of 2,000 men. The next invocations of the Insurrection Act are well, Jefferson invokes it to enforce his hated embargo, but then it's right before the Civil War. Lincoln does it to put down the white men resisting federal authority, to use the resonant phrase of the historian Jefferson Cowles, who's just written a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, looking at one county in Alabama which has given rise to these white insurrectionists throughout history. And Cowles identifies the periods we're talking about. First, the Whiskey Rebellion and Fry's Rebellion period, then the Civil War, then the incredible resistance to Reconstruction and redemption, and then Wallace and the Pettus Bridge. Each of these, as you say, are examples of violence, not peaceful protest, but people actually rising up to subvert the Constitution. And that's always been the test. As early as Fry's Rebellion, John Adams worried that they were converting by their response what he called a riot into an insurrection. And our current debates before the Supreme Court about whether January 6th was a riot or an insurrection go back to the earliest times.
Jeffrey, we are speaking the last day of January 2024, so we have no idea of really what will happen in November. But has the American legal system, has it stood up well so far to Trumpist demagoguery?
Well, the most important reality of the election of 2020 is that the Constitution held, and that nearly all the judges to consider false election fraud claims rejected them. Many appointed by Donald Trump, they were almost uniformly rejected by judges of all backgrounds. And that was a great tribute to the integrity of the American legal system, as well as to the system of American federalism that empowered state election officials to reach their own decisions about how to certify election results. There were other crucial decisions of individual actors, like Vice President Pence's decision to certify the election and to recognize the fact that he had no constitutional authority to overturn it. So narrowly, the system held last time.
Donald Trump has never been shy to disguise his own disaffection with democracy and the legal system. He's promised, at least implicitly at times, that he's going to shut American democracy down. Is it conceivable that if he's elected in November of 2024, that he can essentially shut down American democracy is a rather amorphous term, but the American legal system, and turn it into a mechanism for his own self or political interest?
It's a strong claim, and the answer is that that would be a difficult thing to do. The American legal system is a decentralized system enforced, first of all, by an independent judiciary committed to it. It's also important that the federal courts are matched by a separate state court system, and that there's a tremendously strong culture of the rule of law in America that held during the first Trump administration, as we saw principled appointees, including at the Justice Department, refusing to carry out the president's orders to subvert the rule of law. So the system is designed to prevent a single president from wreaking his will, and it would be hard to do in one sweep.
Is it a good advertisement for the American legal system that Donald Trump is in and out of court so much and will be in 2024?
Well, we'll see, as they say. Certainly, it's urgently important that the system be allowed to take its course, and that politicians of both sides not automatically attack or praise the prosecutions because of their partisan valence. The state court proceedings are separate than the federal court ones. Some of the cases are stronger than others, but certainly the fact that a president can be and is being indicted is a powerful representation of our commitment to the idea that no one's above the law.
Final question, Jeffrey. Who knows what's going to happen in 2024, but is the legal establishment ready? Are they bracing for what might happen in November 2024, perhaps before and after? Men like yourself, Norm Eisen, who's been on the show, is an old friend of How to Fix Democracy. Are you guys ready for the storm that is about to explode?
Well, there's no legal establishment any more than any of the establishments of the great institutions of American democracy are monolithic, but there's certainly bipartisan concern about the grave threat to American democracy posed by Donald Trump. There's a task force that the American Bar Association has convened, led by Judge Michael Ludig and Jay Johnson, which has a group of Republicans and Democrats. I'm on that task force, and there are plenty of people of both parties who are gravely concerned about the future of American democracy.
Well, we all are concerned, although I think many of our viewers will be less concerned, having heard from you, Jeffrey Rosen. Thank you so much for appearing on How to Fix Democracy, and we'll have to have you back after the election to see whether or not American democracy has survived this great storm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.